Klaus Richter thought he was seeing things when the shell bounced. After destroying 11 Soviet tanks at Kursk and perfecting his craft through 2 years of Eastern Front combat, the 26-year-old Obergefreiter had never witnessed anything like what happened that frozen December morning in 1944. The 88mm gun behind him, 16 feet of precision-engineered death, had just fired its signature armor-piercing round at a Sherman tank 300 meters away. The crew watched in stunned silence as their supposedly unstoppable projectile sparked off the American tank's hull and disappeared harmlessly into the grey Belgian sky. This wasn't just a miss. This was impossible. For German anti-tank crews, the 88mm gun wasn't simply a weapon. It was mathematical certainty wrapped in Krupp steel. In 3 years of warfare, no Allied tank had ever survived a direct frontal hit from this monster. Not the hulking British Churchill with its thick infantry support armor. Not the legendary Soviet T-34 with its revolutionary sloped design. And certainly not the American Sherman, that mobile crematorium the Germans mockingly called the Tommy Cooker. But on this morning outside the Belgian village of Krinkelt, mathematical certainty was about to shatter against something that shouldn't have existed. An American tank with armor thick enough to laugh at Germany's most feared anti-tank gun. The gun that defined 3 years of war. To understand the earthquake that shook Klaus Richter's world that December morning, you need to understand what the 88mm gun meant to the German Wehrmacht. It wasn't just artillery, it was the physical manifestation of German technological superiority, the steel backbone that had held together 3 years of increasingly desperate defensive warfare. The story began in the early 1930s with the Flak 18, originally designed to knock bombers out of the sky. German engineers had created something remarkable, an anti-aircraft gun with such tremendous muzzle velocity that it could reach targets at extreme altitude. But velocity meant penetration, and penetration meant opportunity. During the Spanish Civil War, crews from the German Condor Legion made a discovery that would reshape armored warfare forever. When Republican tanks threatened their positions, gunners swiveled their 88s horizontal and opened fire. The results were catastrophic for the tanks. Shells designed to destroy aircraft at 20,000 feet punched through tank armor like tissue paper. Wehrmacht planners took careful notes. By 1940, the 88 had been officially adapted for anti-tank work, and by 1943, the Pak-43 variant pushed performance to terrifying new levels. Its tungsten core ammunition could penetrate 6 inches of solid steel at 1,000 meters. At typical combat ranges, those heart-stopping engagements where tanks faced off at 300 to 500 meters, there wasn't an Allied tank in service that could withstand a direct hit. The numbers told a story of absolute dominance. A 1944 US Army study revealed that German 88mm guns accounted for roughly 30% of all Sherman losses in Normandy, despite representing less than 10% of German anti-tank weapons. These guns could engage Allied armor from ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, far beyond the effective reach of American 75mm guns. For every 88mm anti-tank gun destroyed, German crews claimed an average of 7 Allied tanks. German gunners knew these statistics. More importantly, they felt them in their bones. Training emphasized this technological superiority with religious fervor. Gunnery instructors taught that the only challenge was hitting the target. Penetration was guaranteed. Doctrine assumed that any Allied tank once struck was automatically destroyed. After-action reports reinforced this assumption month after month, battle after battle. This psychological certainty extended far beyond gun crews. German infantry knew that if an 88 was positioned, Allied armor couldn't advance. Commanders built entire defensive strategies around the gun's capabilities, placing them at crucial crossroads and along predicted approach routes. The mere presence of an 88, even hidden and silent, could halt an Allied offensive. American tankers called them murder guns. British crews whispered about widowmakers. Soviet reports described positions defended by 88s as zones of death. By late 1944, as Germany's strategic situation grew increasingly desperate, the 88 represented one of the few technological advantages the Wehrmacht still possessed. German tank production couldn't match Allied output. The vaunted Panther and Tiger tanks, though formidable, were mechanical nightmares plagued by breakdowns. But the 88, whether mounted on tank destroyers or deployed as towed anti-tank guns, remained reliable, effective, and psychologically dominant. As the Wehrmacht launched its final desperate offensive in the Ardennes that December, 88mm crews rolled forward with the unshakable confidence of men who had never been proven wrong. That confidence was about to meet something that would shatter it forever. The American death trap. While German gunners operated with supreme confidence, American tank crews entered combat in 1944 carrying a very different psychological burden. They climbed into their M4 Sherman tanks, knowing with brutal statistical certainty that they were outmatched, outgunned, and quite possibly driving their own coffins. The Sherman wasn't designed to fight German heavy armor. It was designed to be produced in quantities that German industry could never hope to match. This represented sound strategic thinking, but it provided cold comfort to the men sealed inside these steel boxes. Consider the numbers that haunted American tankers. The Sherman's frontal armor measured 2 inches on the hull and 3 inches on the turret in its most common variant. Later models improved this to approximately 4 inches on the glacis plate when accounting for its 47-degree slope. These specifications had been adequate against German armor in 1942 and early 1943. By late 1944, they were death sentences written in statistics. A German 88mm Pak-43 could punch through 4 inches of armor at 1,500 meters, ranges where American gunners could effectively return fire. The German Panther tank, armed with its long-barreled 75mm gun, could destroy a Sherman from the front at 1,000 meters while remaining effectively immune to the Sherman's gun at the same range. The Tiger, with its massive 88mm KWK-36, represented an even more extreme mismatch. American tactical doctrine acknowledged this reality with brutal honesty that would have been shocking to civilian observers. Training manuals instructed Sherman crews to avoid frontal engagements with German heavy armor whenever possible. The preferred tactic involved using numerical superiority, throwing multiple Shermans at a single German tank to create flanking opportunities. Official doctrine suggested it took 5 Shermans to reliably destroy 1 Panther. Crews darkened this into gallows humor. 4 Shermans to distract the Panther, 1 to sneak around behind. The nickname Ronson, after the cigarette lighter company's slogan "Lights every time," reflected the Sherman's nightmarish tendency to burst into flames when penetrated. Early models stored ammunition in sponsons along the hull sides, directly in the path of incoming shells. A penetrating hit often ignited propellant charges, creating internal firestorms that reached lethal temperatures within 30 seconds. Many crew members never made it out. Later variants moved ammunition storage below the turret basket and added water jackets for fire suppression, but the reputation persisted like a curse. Every Sherman crew knew the statistics. A 1944 study by the 3rd Armored Division found that 62% of tank crew casualties occurred within the first 30 days of combat. The average operational lifespan of a Sherman in heavy fighting was measured in weeks, sometimes days. Crews rotated through replacement tanks with disturbing frequency, inheriting machines that still bore scorch marks and impact craters from their previous occupants' final battles. Yet Shermans kept rolling off production lines in staggering numbers. American factories produced nearly 50,000 M4 variants during the war, compared to approximately 6,000 Panthers and 1,300 Tigers from German factories. The Sherman's mechanical reliability, maintenance simplicity, and logistical efficiency meant American armored formations could sustain operations indefinitely, while German heavy tanks spent more time awaiting spare parts than fighting. This created a strategic paradox that haunted American armor doctrine. Strategically, the Sherman was winning the war through sheer industrial momentum. Tactically, individual crews faced terrifying odds every time German heavy weapons appeared on the horizon. The tankers who fought through Normandy's hedgerows, who engaged Panthers at point-blank range in Norman villages, understood that their survival depended not on armor thickness, but on speed concealment and desperate hope that the next German gun would somehow miss. Into this environment of calculated desperation, in the summer of 1944, arrived 254 tanks that would rewrite every assumption about American armor capabilities. The impossible tank. They looked like ordinary Shermans from a distance. Same silhouette, same turret shape, same familiar angular hull that had become synonymous with American armor. But beneath that deceptive exterior lay something that bordered on the miraculous, armor protection that could stand toe-to-toe with German heavy tanks. The M4A3E2 assault tank emerged not from careful long-term planning, but from desperate necessity recognized in the spring of 1944. As Allied commanders prepared for the invasion of Normandy, intelligence reports painted an increasingly disturbing picture of German coastal fortifications. The Atlantic Wall bristled with concrete bunkers, reinforced strongpoints, and layered anti-tank obstacles designed to turn any landing into a bloodbath. Breaking through these defenses would require armor capable of leading infantry assaults while absorbing punishment that would vaporize standard tanks. The problem landed on the desk of Major General Gladian Barnes, Chief of the Army Ordnance Department's Research and Development Service. His solution was elegantly simple and brutally effective. Take proven Sherman chassis and add as much armor as the mechanical components could physically support. No revolutionary redesign, no lengthy testing periods, just raw, additional steel welded onto existing hulls. The Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, received the contract in May 1944. Engineers calculated that the M4A3 chassis, powered by its Ford GAA V8 engine producing 500 horsepower, could support an additional 9 tons of armor without catastrophic mechanical failure. What they created defied every assumption about American tank design. The base hull armor was doubled. The glacis plate received an additional 1.5 inches of face-hardened steel, bringing total thickness to approximately 5.5 inches at a 47-degree angle. When accounting for slope effects, this created effective thickness approaching 7 inches against direct fire. The turret transformation was even more dramatic. Frontal casting increased to 7 inches of solid steel. The mantlet protecting the gun mount measured nearly 8 inches at its thickest point. Even side armor increased from 1.5 inches to 3 inches, while protective skirts shielded the tracks from hollow charge weapons. The weight penalty was massive. Combat weight increased from 33 tons to 42 tons. Top speed dropped from 30 miles per hour to approximately 22. The power-to-weight ratio, already marginal on standard Shermans, plummeted to 14 horsepower per ton, making the Jumbo sluggish in acceleration and poor at climbing steep grades. None of this mattered if the armor performed as designed. Production began in June 1944 and concluded by the end of July, a testament to American industrial flexibility that would have been impossible in any other nation's wartime economy. The limited run of 254 tanks reflected both the project's urgency and its inherent limitations. Each Jumbo required approximately 12 tons of additional steel at a time when every pound of armor plate was allocated to competing priorities. The decision was made to produce a small number of specialized assault tanks rather than marginally improve a larger fleet, a calculated gamble that would pay dividends far beyond its limited numbers. The controversial decision to retain the original 75mm M3 gun sparked heated debate within ordnance circles. Officials argued that the Jumbo's primary role was absorbing fire and creating breaches in enemy defenses, not engaging enemy armor at long range. The shorter, lower-velocity 75mm gun offered superior high-explosive performance for bunker-busting missions. This meant Jumbo crews would possess extraordinary protection while carrying a gun inadequate for the heavy German tanks they would inevitably encounter, a compromise that would define every engagement these remarkable machines fought. The Ghost Tank program. The first Jumbos reached European shores in late July 1944, weeks after the Normandy landings had already established the crucial beachheads. But rather than being concentrated into dedicated heavy tank battalions, these precious few assault tanks were scattered across multiple armored divisions like seeds in a vast field. The 2nd Armored Division received 30. The 3rd Armored Division received 34. The 4th Armored Division, which would later spearhead Patton's legendary drive across France, received 22. This dispersal strategy ensured that most American tankers never saw a jumbo in action. More critically, it meant that most German intelligence officers never encountered enough of them to recognize a pattern. No formal doctrine existed for employing these revolutionary machines. Company commanders found themselves with tanks whose armor specifications seemed almost fantastical, but no training manual explaining how to exploit them. Some used jumbos as spearheads for urban assaults. Others positioned them as mobile pillboxes in defensive operations. A few enterprising commanders placed them at the point of column advances, trusting the armor to survive the first German ambush and reveal enemy positions. The crews themselves were standard Sherman tankers, not specially selected elite units or specially trained assault specialists. They learned their tanks' capabilities through trial and error, often under the most unforgiving teacher of all, enemy fire. The weight difference became apparent immediately. The jumbo accelerated like a freight train carrying extra cargo, struggled through mud that standard Shermans navigated easily, and consumed fuel at rates that horrified supply officers. But when German anti-tank guns opened fire, something magical happened. Crews began reporting hits from weapons that would have destroyed standard Shermans, hits that left nothing more than dents and scorch marks on the jumbo's massively armored hull. Word spread informally through American formations. Certain Sherman tanks, identical in silhouette to standard models, were nearly invulnerable from the front. But this information remained strictly within American circles, shared through battlefield gossip and maintenance reports, rather than official intelligence channels. German intelligence, already overwhelmed by the collapse of France and the need to track hundreds of Allied units advancing on multiple fronts, never identified the jumbo as a distinct variant, requiring special tactical consideration. The failure would prove catastrophic. The intelligence catastrophe. The German military's failure to identify and counter the Jumbo Sherman represents one of World War II's most consequential intelligence oversights. It wasn't the result of incompetence or laziness, but rather the natural consequence of a military intelligence apparatus that had been systematically dismantled by 3 years of losses, strategic overextension, and the cumulative effects of Allied counterintelligence operations. By late 1944, German military intelligence, the Fremde Heere West or Foreign Armies West, operated under conditions approaching blindness. The Abwehr, Germany's primary military intelligence service, had been thoroughly compromised by Allied double agents and absorbed into the SS earlier that year. Long-range reconnaissance aircraft, essential for gathering tactical intelligence on Allied movements, had been swept from European skies by overwhelming Allied air superiority. The Luftwaffe could barely protect German cities, much less conduct systematic reconnaissance of Allied rear areas where new equipment would first appear. Human intelligence networks in Britain and France had been systematically identified and eliminated. The spectacular success of Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception plan surrounding D-Day, demonstrated just how completely German intelligence had been penetrated and manipulated. Officers who had once confidently assessed Allied capabilities now operated on fragments, rumors, and information that was often months out of date. The Jumbo's limited production numbers worked perfectly in favor of maintaining secrecy. 254 tanks represented less than 0.5% of total Sherman production. Distributed across multiple divisions on a front stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea, they appeared with such rarity that initial sightings were dismissed as anomalies or observer errors. A German anti-tank crew reporting that an 88mm shell had bounced off a Sherman was more likely to be accused of missing the target entirely than believed to have encountered a revolutionary new tank variant. Moreover, the Jumbo's external appearance closely matched standard Shermans in every detail that mattered for rapid battlefield identification. Unlike the British Churchill or Soviet IS-2, which were visually distinct, heavy tanks, the Jumbo retained the familiar Sherman silhouette that German gunners had been trained to recognize and engage. At typical combat ranges of 300 to 500 meters, often through smoke, vegetation, or poor weather conditions, German crews had mere seconds to identify targets and engage. The training that had served them well for 3 years, Sherman equals thin armor equals easy kill, now betrayed them with deadly consistency. The few Jumbos that were destroyed and subsequently examined provided misleading intelligence data. If a jumbo was knocked out by a hit to the side or rear, where armor remained relatively thin, examination teams would note standard Sherman construction details. If a jumbo was disabled by mechanical failure or abandoned during retreat, stripping crews prioritized weapons, optics, and radio equipment over the time-consuming process of measuring armor thickness. The incremental nature of armor enhancement meant that field measurements might show variations without revealing the systematic upgrade that made frontal engagement impossible. German tactical doctrine compounded the intelligence problem. By late 1944, Wehrmacht defensive tactics emphasized mobility, ambush, and strategic withdrawal over static defensive positions. Anti-tank guns were positioned to engage tank flanks and vulnerable rear armor, not to fight prolonged frontal duels where the jumbo's advantages would become apparent. When a jumbo did appear in German crosshairs and survive multiple frontal hits, crews often assumed they had misjudged the angle or range rather than questioning their fundamental assumptions about American armor capabilities. Perhaps most significantly, the timing of jumbo deployment coincided with Germany's broader strategic collapse in multiple theaters. During summer and fall 1944, German forces were reeling from catastrophic losses in Operation Bagration on the Eastern Front, the collapse of Army Group Center, the failed Falaise Pocket in France, and the loss of Romania's critical oil fields. Intelligence resources focused desperately on identifying existential threats to Germany's survival. Soviet offensives, Allied airborne operations, and the anticipated invasion across the Rhine River. A slightly better armored Sherman variant, appearing in microscopic numbers on a front where hundreds of Allied tanks operated daily, simply didn't register as a priority concern worthy of systematic investigation. Intelligence summaries from September through November 1944 make no mention of enhanced Sherman armor capabilities. Tactical bulletins continued warning of improved Allied anti-tank weapons and overwhelming air superiority, but assessment of American tanks remained unchanged, vulnerable to German anti-tank guns at standard combat ranges. This intelligence failure created something far more valuable than tactical surprise. It created a profound psychological weapon that would shatter German confidence at the moment when morale mattered most. When certainty shattered, the morning of December 17, 1944, elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division encountered 3 jumbos from Company B, 33rd Armored Regiment, 3rd Armored Division, near the Belgian town of Bulgenbach. The German force was formidable, 5 Tiger tanks and multiple PaK-43 anti-tank guns positioned in carefully prepared ambush positions designed to destroy American reinforcements moving toward the breakthrough sector. The terrain favored the defenders perfectly. Open fields with minimal cover forced Allied armor to advance along predictable routes directly into German killing zones. At ranges exceeding 1,000 meters, the Tigers and anti-tank guns had clear fields of fire against targets that would be forced to approach across open ground. Under normal circumstances, the engagement would have been a massacre. The 3 jumbos leading the American column approached with confidence that would have been suicidal in standard Shermans. Their commanders, having learned their tanks' capabilities through previous battles, advanced with an aggression that stunned German observers, expecting typical American caution when facing heavy German armor. The German guns opened fire at 800 meters, point-blank range for weapons of this caliber. The first Tiger's 88mm round struck the lead jumbo's glacis plate at a slight angle, penetrating the outer applique layer but failing completely to breach the base armor. The impact sent shockwaves through the crew compartment, momentarily stunning the driver, but the tank continued its advance without pause. The Tiger crew, confused by their target's survival, fired again immediately. The second round struck the turret front with tremendous force. Again, no penetration. The massive kinetic energy that should have turned the crew compartment into a charnel house simply dissipated against steel thick enough to laugh at Germany's most feared tank gun. The jumbo's gunner, now oriented on the Tiger's muzzle flash, returned fire with his 75mm gun. While inadequate for frontal penetration of Tiger armor, the round struck the German tank's gun mantlet with sufficient force to jam the traverse mechanism, effectively mission-killing the vehicle and forcing its withdrawal from the engagement. The remaining German armor, watching a Sherman absorb multiple 88mm hits and continue fighting effectively, hesitated. That momentary hesitation cost them the initiative they had held for 3 years of warfare. What followed was a chaotic close-range engagement as American infantry and additional Sherman tanks, both standard and jumbo variants, pushed into the German position with an aggression that defied all previous American tactical behavior. By noon, the German force had withdrawn in disorder, having destroyed 2 standard Shermans, but completely failing to stop the armored column they had been positioned to destroy. The 3 jumbos that led the assault bore multiple impact marks across their hulls and turrets, battle scars that would have marked grave sites for standard Sherman crews. Not one had suffered frontal penetration. The psychological earthquake. Similar patterns repeated across the Bulge salient with devastating effects on German morale. Near Bastogne, a single jumbo from the 4th Armored Division's 37th Tank Battalion held a crucial crossroads against repeated German attacks throughout December 20th. The tank, commanded by Staff Sergeant William McVeigh, absorbed 17 anti-tank rounds over 6 hours of continuous fighting. German forces, convinced they were engaging a fixed fortification rather than a mobile tank, eventually bypassed the position rather than continue expending irreplaceable ammunition on what seemed to be an invulnerable target. The psychological effects rippled through German formations like an earthquake. After-action reports from the 6th Panzer Army, obtained from captured documents, revealed growing confusion about American armor capabilities that bordered on panic. One report from late December stated, "Enemy tank variants observed with improved frontal protection, 88mm penetration unreliable at ranges below 500 meters. Recommend targeting tracks and flanks exclusively." The language represents a seismic shift in German tactical thinking. Never before had Wehrmacht doctrine described 88mm penetration as unreliable. The weapon's effectiveness had been assumed, not questioned, for 3 years of successful employment. The recommendation to target tracks and flanks represented fundamental admission that frontal engagement, the bread and butter of German anti-tank tactics, was no longer guaranteed to succeed against American armor. For American crews, the jumbo provided something more valuable than physical protection. It offered psychological liberation from 3 years of accepting vulnerability as the price of serving in armored units. Tankers who had spent months understanding that survival depended primarily on luck and maneuver suddenly possessed armor capable of standing and fighting German heavy weapons on nearly equal terms. This confidence translated immediately into tactical aggression. Jumbos were pushed forward into positions where standard Shermans would have been immediately withdrawn. They served as rallying points for infantry advances, mobile cover for attacking troops, and psychological weapons whose mere presence altered German tactical calculations. Yet the jumbo's limitations remained stark and potentially fatal. Side armor, though improved to 3 inches, remained vulnerable to German 75mm and 88mm guns at typical combat ranges. Rear armor at 1.5 inches could be penetrated by lighter anti-tank weapons that standard Shermans could also defeat. The reduced mobility made jumbos vulnerable to flanking maneuvers and difficult to extract when terrain became unfavorable. Most critically, the 75mm gun meant that jumbos could not reliably penetrate German heavy armor frontally. A jumbo facing a Tiger or Panther in open terrain possessed armor superiority but firepower inferiority, creating tactical puzzles that depended on terrain, crew skill, and often pure chance. Could the jumbo close to point-blank range where its gun might find weak spots in German armor? Would the superior German gun eventually achieve a side or rear hit that negated the American armor advantage? The answers varied with each engagement, but the mere fact that such encounters became tactical problems rather than certain American losses represented a revolutionary shift in armored warfare dynamics. The Winter of Change. The Jumbo Sherman's combat record through the winter of 1944 to 45 revealed both extraordinary strengths and inherent limitations that would influence American tank design for decades. As the Battle of the Bulge ground toward its bloody conclusion in late January, American armored divisions, compiled after-action reports attempting to quantify what their crews had experienced viscerally. The statistics told a remarkable story of survival against odds that had been insurmountable just months earlier. Standard M4 Shermans operating in heavy combat during the Bulge suffered loss rates approaching 40% in some battalions, casualty figures that would have represented catastrophic defeats in earlier conflicts. Jumbos operating under identical conditions, often leading the same attacks and facing the same German weapons, experienced loss rates below 15%. The difference was almost entirely attributable to frontal armor protection that could defeat the weapons that had dominated armored warfare for 3 years. When Jumbos were knocked out, post-battle analysis consistently showed hits to sides, rear surfaces, or catastrophic mechanical failures rather than frontal penetrations. The mathematical certainty that had characterized German anti-tank operations since 1941 had been replaced by tactical uncertainty that undermined confidence and combat effectiveness. But these encouraging statistics concealed a more complex tactical reality that frustrated American commanders. The Jumbo's limited firepower meant it could survive encounters with German heavy armor without being able to definitively defeat those same targets. In engagements where Jumbos faced Panthers or Tigers, the typical outcome was stalemate or withdrawal, rather than decisive American victory. The Jumbo could survive the encounter, allowing its crew to fight another day, but it couldn't eliminate the German tank that had failed to eliminate it. This limitation drove urgent field modifications that pushed the boundaries of battlefield improvisation. Beginning in January 1945, some Jumbos received 76mm guns salvaged from destroyed standard Shermans. The conversion was completely unofficial, performed by maintenance units using whatever resources they could scrounge from the wreckage of tank battles. The longer, higher-velocity 76mm gun gave Jumbos a genuine fighting chance against German heavy armor at ranges where their superior frontal protection could be fully exploited. Approximately 40 to 50 Jumbos received this upgrade, though exact numbers remain uncertain due to the informal nature of modifications performed under battlefield conditions. Crews universally praised the results. A Jumbo mounting a 76mm gun could engage Panthers on nearly equal terms, possessing comparable armor protection and adequate firepower to achieve kills rather than mere survival. Against Tigers, the matchup remained challenging but no longer hopeless. These hybrid Jumbos represented what American armor doctrine had desperately needed since Normandy. Tanks capable of both surviving and winning direct combat against German heavy armor. The legacy of 254 tanks. Even as these modifications proceeded, the strategic context surrounding armored warfare was shifting dramatically. By February 1945, German resistance in the West was collapsing under the combined weight of overwhelming Allied numerical superiority, complete air dominance, and industrial paralysis. The failure of the Ardennes offensive had consumed Germany's last mobile reserves and remaining fuel stockpiles. Allied air superiority meant that surviving German tanks could barely move during daylight hours without attracting devastating air attacks. The tactical problem that the Jumbo had been designed to solve, breaking through prepared German defensive positions, was being solved instead by crushing numerical and logistical superiority that made individual tank capabilities increasingly irrelevant to strategic outcomes. Yet the Jumbo's psychological impact persisted far beyond its tactical utility in the war's final months. German gunners who had encountered heavily armored Shermans carried that experience into subsequent engagements, approaching each encounter with caution and uncertainty that would have been unthinkable earlier in the conflict. The absolute confidence that had characterized 88mm crews throughout 3 years of successful employment was replaced by hesitation and doubt that undermined combat effectiveness even when facing standard American armor. For American tankers, the Jumbo's existence provided something more valuable than its limited numbers might suggest: definitive proof that American industry could produce armor equal to German standards when strategic priorities demanded such capability. The narrative that American tanks were inherently inferior, that crews had to accept vulnerability as the inevitable price of mobility and reliability, was conclusively shattered by 254 tanks that could stand toe-to-toe with the best German armor. Later American tank designs, including the M26 Pershing heavy tank that arrived in small numbers during early 1945, directly reflected lessons learned from the Jumbo program. The recognition that crews needed protection sufficient to survive opening moments of engagement, even at the cost of speed or operational range, became central to post-war American armored doctrine. The tension between protection, firepower, and mobility that the Jumbo embodied influenced development of the M46, M47, and ultimately the M48 Patton tanks that would dominate American armored forces through the 1950s and into the Cold War era. Perhaps most significantly, the Jumbo represented American industrial flexibility at its finest, the capacity to identify a critical problem, develop an effective solution, and field that solution in operationally meaningful quantities within months rather than years. The fact that only 254 Jumbos were built might seem insignificant against total Sherman production exceeding 49,000 vehicles. But those 254 tanks appeared exactly when they were most desperately needed, performed exactly as required under the most demanding combat conditions, and survived at rates that saved hundreds of American lives while fundamentally altering the psychological balance of armored warfare. The crews who fought in Jumbos carried their experience into peacetime, with memories that emphasized the confidence that came from knowing their armor could protect them. The tactical aggression such protection enabled, and profound gratitude toward the engineers and industrial workers who had built their survival into steel plate and welding joints. For men who had previously accepted that survival in armored combat was largely a matter of chance, the Jumbo provided something invaluable: a degree of control over their own fate, the ability to stand and fight rather than simply hope to avoid being hit. Klaus Richter survived the war, though he never forgot that December morning when his mathematical certainty shattered against American steel. In interviews decades later, he would describe the moment his 88mm round bounced off that impossible Sherman as the instant he knew Germany had lost more than a battle. They had lost their technological edge, their psychological dominance, and ultimately their war. The tank that should not have existed had proven that American industry could achieve the impossible when pushed to its limits. And for 254 crews, who fought in machines that refused to die when they should have, that made all the difference between coming home and becoming another casualty statistic in history's bloodiest conflict.